The 1980s was a really important era for video games. Back then, the industry was still emerging and developing in ways that would define it for the next decade or so, and arguably still do today, with amusement arcades playing an indispensable role. They were always where you'd reliably find the coolest games and the best hardware to play them on, and the simple economics of running a business predicated on getting the public to repeatedly shovel coins into machines gave rise to some memorably ingenious game design. But if the 80s was a great era for arcade games, just think what a time the early 1990s were, when the first wave of portable go-anywhere game consoles was starting to establish themselves. You didn't have to plug them into a TV, you could play your games on the bus, or in the bathroom. If you had a Nintendo Game Boy, Atari Lynx or Sega Game Gear, you had access to a library of games that you could play literally anywhere, even in the arcade. Wait a minute. Taito's Bubble is one of that breed of delightfully simple games that used to be a staple of amusement arcades back in the 80s. Its bold, cartoony sprites and instantly accessible gameplay give it loads of charm, and it's one of those games I've been so enamoured with since childhood that I've tried to make sure I owned a version of it for whatever home computer or console I had at any given time. The aim of the game is disarmingly simple. Playing as a cute little dinosaur, or two cute little dinosaurs if you have a friend to hand, you play through a variety of single-screen stages filled with assorted enemies and collectibles. Your goal is to clear each stage of all the wind-up monsters, ghosts, teddy bear helicopters and other weird creations in them by trapping them in bubbles and then bursting them. Grabbing the different items that show up, which include fruit, diamonds, shoes, cake and candies, will net you bonus points. Occasionally, special bubbles will appear with letters in them, which you can collect to form a set that spells the word extend, no laughing at the back, and that'll earn you an extra life. As you clear each stage, you'll move on to the next, and get a little closer to completing the game. It's as simple as that. But things are made more interesting by the behaviour of the different beasties you'll face and the appearance of balloons that release bolts of electricity or a deluge of water when you pop them. All the fun of Bubble lies in these details, making it a game that requires good reflexes and a thoughtful approach. Things start off easy enough, with stage layouts that make it a cinch to deal with your enemies in no time at all. But before long, tricky level design and fast-moving enemies start making things difficult. You'd think a game built around such a simple premise as this would be perfectly suited to handhelds, and you'd be right. I've rarely met a version of this game that I didn't like. But handheld ports of these kinds of games have always been a bit of an uncertain proposition, especially when we're talking about early portable systems, and Bubble's translation to Sega's portable evidently wasn't a straightforward task. As mind-blowing as it was back in the day to hold a full-colour console like the Sega Game Gear in your hands, it has to be said that the whole notion of gaming on the go was still something of a novelty. Hardware developers were still finding their way with handhelds, and certain practicalities forced limitations on them, meaning that even the comparatively undemanding nature of a single-screen arcade game could hamper the best efforts to port it to those platforms. If you ever played Ms. Pac-Man on the Game Gear, you may have some idea what I mean. The console's capable of a lot, but its screen dimensions pose problems for conversions of arcade games with vertical screens and fixed aspect ratios. Inevitably, that means a few concessions had to be made to keep this one playable, but it's impressive to see just how complete and faithful this first ever full-colour portable version really is. The Game Gear often gets described as a portable Sega Master System, which, as best I can tell, is broadly accurate, give or take a few details. And considering Bubble received a very good port on the Master System, drawing a comparison between that version and this portable one seems inevitable. At a glance, you'd maybe never guess anything was different. The presentation feels remarkably similar, from the front end right into the game itself. It's a great representation of the arcade game, and there's no two ways about it. This is Taito's game without a hint of visual compromise. The character sprites are colourful and recognisable, as are the enormous wealth of tasty calorific treats that appear throughout the stages. All that visual charm the coin-op had is fully preserved, but look a little closer and the differences become apparent. To fit everything on the Game Gear's screen, many of the levels have been redesigned, but to the developer's credit, it's not immediately noticeable. It might seem a little disappointing to realise that things have been tweaked in this respect, but at least the stages are redesigned with an eye on retaining the feel of the originals. The only adverse effect I noted this downsizing has on the gameplay is that it makes it harder to use one of the classic Bubble moves, where you blow a bubble and jump to bounce off of it for extra height. It's still possible to do that in this version, so it's not like it's a gameplay feature that's been completely removed. It's just that the stages are that bit more cramped and squished down now, so most of the time you won't find yourself with enough room to do it. I can live with that though. In fact, I've got a bigger problem with the game's other most noticeable tweak. To see your score and how many of the special extend bubbles you've collected, you have to press the Game Gear's start button, so anytime you want to check, you're yanked out of the game. It's kind of irritating, because Bubble Bobble is the sort of game where it doesn't feel completely pointless to play with an eye on your point score. Scoring big is another way to earn extra lives after all. Most home conversions give you all this information somewhere on the play area, and I prefer that way of doing things, just because it makes it much easier to keep track of. In every other regard though, as I mentioned earlier, Bubble Bobble on the Game Gear feels legit, and it plays really well. The controls are responsive, the pace of the gameplay is exactly right, the endlessly repeating music that's catchier and more memorable than you want it to be for the sake of your sanity is still there, and it'll still drive you mad. But most importantly, the game's still a lot of fun. I'd be lying if I said the Game Gear version of Bubble Bobble was my favourite, and it's certainly not a conversion that will appeal to obsessive purists who demand absolute perfection from arcade ports. But then, looking back at this generation of consoles, that was a rare thing to see, and to expect such a thing from a handheld marketed in the 90s would be downright silly. The fact is, even though it's not without a few issues, this is still a great little game to kick back with. It plays about as closely to the arcade original as you could hope, considering the idiosyncrasies of the hardware. But probably the highest praise I can give it is that that's what it feels like, rather than some kind of knockoff that wears Bubble Bobble's skin, but feels like a different game underneath. It's about as authentic a version as you could ever expect from Sega's handheld, so if your Game Gear's still kicking, it's definitely worth checking out.